Hello and welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival. I'm Greta Johnsen. I'm a host and producer of WBEZ's Nerdette podcast, and it is my absolute pleasure to be here with Veronica Roth, the best-selling author of the Divergent Series, as well as her latest book, The Chosen Ones. Thank you so much for joining us. I have just a couple of businessy things to get through, and then we can get started. So first, I want to tell you that the Chicago Humanities Festival connects people and ideas to cultivate a more informed, inspired, empathetic, and participatory society. You can learn more about CHF's digital festival and how you can support programming just like this by going to chicagohumanities.org. Many thanks to the Allstate Insurance Company for generously underwriting this event, and special thanks to our captioner for helping to make this program as accessible as possible. I know this isn't exactly the event that we had all envisioned earlier this year, but I am so glad that you were able to be with us this evening, and I'm confident that we're still going to have a good time. What's really fun about this format is that you are invited to participate. So if you have questions for Veronica, you can even start submitting them now if you want. All you have to do is add your questions and comments into the YouTube chat box, and then we'll try to respond to as many of those as we can throughout the conversation. To post a question, just to warn you, you are going to have to log into your Google account. Also, if you haven't yet gotten a copy of Chosen Ones, we just want to make sure that you know that you can support Chicago Humanities Festival by getting the book through their partner bookseller Seminary Co-op, and info for that is in the comments section of YouTube. So it is time to get started. Veronica Roth is the #1 New York Times best-selling author of the Divergent series, along with the Carve the Mark duology. That's a collection of short fiction, also a collection of short fiction called The End and Other Beginnings, and many short stories and essays. She lives here in Chicago. Veronica, welcome.
Hi.
How are you?
Thanks for all of that and for being here with me. This is great.
So I'm super excited to talk to you about Chosen Ones. I think it is an excellent book. It's a fascinating premise. But before we dive in, I thought it would be interesting to talk for just a couple of minutes about what your life would be like under normal circumstances if you had just published a book that came out 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, so I had a 15-city tour planned throughout the month of April. And because it was like every weekday in April, that was covered. And so I would be, gosh, I don't know. I think I'd be on the West Coast right now, probably, I think it was like Washington by this point. But yeah, I would be well traveled at this point, but I've been home.
But you've still done, I feel like you have really made the best of this in terms of being able to shift to like a digital strategy from
Well,
what would normally be doing a bunch of events in a bunch of different places. Yeah.
yeah, I think I felt, after it was hard to cancel the tour. I mean, it was obviously like the only option available, so it wasn't a hard decision, but um, it was difficult because it was like, okay, well, we have to rethink everything about this book release. But on the other hand, I felt I like kind of uniquely suited for it because I am already active on Instagram and know how live things work and have done a lot of video stuff. So I was like, all right, well, at least I'm not, 20 years older and kind of unsure of what Zoom is. It
Yeah,
could be harder.
yeah, that's got to be in your favor for sure. So we got a kind of a fun question from the audience, and then we'll dive into Chosen Ones. Annalisa wanted to know, what's your favorite part about being an author?
Ooh. Well, I mean, honestly, my favorite part is writing. So I've always loved that. And that's why I wanted to be an author because I was like, I wonder if someone will pay me to do this thing I like to do. And so that's kind of the best part, but there is a surprising part that I wasn't sure how I would feel about, which is just interacting with readers and having that gratifying experience when someone understands exactly what you're trying to say. That's like, there's nothing like it. So those are kind of the two different parts that are the best for me.
Yeah, I think that's really, it's something that I think about a lot as a person who interviews a fair number of authors, is that it seems to me like there's such different skill sets, like sitting alone in a room, coming up with amazing ideas, writing a really great book versus like being out in the world and engaging with people about this thing you just made,
Yes, it's very, I think about this every time I go to a conference or a festival and see authors, on panels and stuff. I'm like, wow, this is a group of people who voluntarily chose to be alone in a room for about a year or two or more. And now they're like in front of us. Like, it's amazing that anyone is able to do it competently, because I think those are two, like you said, very different skill sets.
Yeah, I am impressed. I just want you to know that for the
Thank you.
record.
Appreciate that.
So yeah, let's discuss this amazing book.
Yeah, I like knocked out a whole stack of them back there, trying to be Vanna White.
I did not notice that you knocked him over. That's amazing. So yeah, tell me about how you came up with the idea for this book. I feel like, all of us, I'm sure if you read any like YA or sci-fi or fantasy, are familiar with the kind of like chosen ones trope or genre, or chosen one usually, I guess. Why did you decide to like spin it the way you did? What made you think that you wanted to take part in this conversation around this theme?
Well, like you said, they're the chosen one trope, which I'm defining as like someone set apart for a world-saving destiny. Just them or them and a group, because one of my formative chosen one stories was Animorphs, which was like
Yes.
an endless and dark series. But yes, amazing. And there were 5 of them. So, maybe that influenced me with this book, because there's also 5 of mine. But in any case, yeah, I grew up with the Chosen One stories, and I find them to be interesting. And also, I'm not sure why I love them so much. Like, I'm still working it out. I think one of the reasons I love them is because those characters are kind of lonely in a way. Like, they have to decide to embrace this destiny that's been handed to them most of the time, and that can be, they both crave the specialness and also hate it. I think there's that struggle, and I find that really interesting. But essentially, I was thinking about our kind of like big cultural stories, like our main like archetypical stories, like the Chosen One story. And there were a couple things I was curious about, like what happens to the love interest? Like, what's her story? Usually it's a her.
Partly what you're exploring is that so often the chosen one is a teenager who ends up having to go through this like intensely traumatic event, and then you assume that they're still going to be like dating the same person 10 years later.
Yeah, and like, are they capable of having like an emotionally healthy relationship after that? Because they haven't really had the foundational experiences that would allow them to do that. And like you said, they've been through a trauma. Like in Chosen Ones, they're famous for killing a man. I mean, that's basically like, he might have deserved it, but they're still famous for that, which is not, I don't know. There's a lot going on there. That's not an easy thing to be famous for, and that was something that I thought would be interesting to explore.
Yeah, there are a lot of things I loved about this book, but one of them, I just found it very refreshing to encounter. So like when we start with Chosen Ones, it's 10 years after this group of 5 teenagers have defeated this bad guy. And, so often that is the climax of the Chosen One genre series, right? Is like, okay, we killed Voldemort, we're good to go, we can all go home now. But to really consider sort of the trauma and the impact of it, I think is really important, and in some ways like makes those stories seem more realistic, because you're putting them in like a time frame that is kind of like what real life would be.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you liked it. But I don't know. I think we do see continuations sometimes. So you get to know like the aftermath of Harry Potter through that epilogue and then subsequent kind of additions
Totally.
to that universe. And then like Dune Messiah is the continuation of Dune. But I was curious more about like the day-to-day life aftermath of it, which of course is not going to be the concern of those like texts, which is fine. But I was like, how does Harry Potter go grocery shopping after taking down the Dark Lord? Like, I need to, inquiring minds want to know. So this is kind of my nod to those stories, I guess.
Well, and another thing that you've pointed out that I think is a really interesting distinction is that, and obviously, of course, there are exceptions, but in general, I think especially, 20 or 30 years ago, most of the books in the sort of chosen one genre were about teenage boys.
Yes. Yeah. I
So
think the only chosen one of my youth who was a woman was Buffy.
Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yes.
Who is, I mean, a pretty great person to break that ceiling, I suppose.
Well done.
So did you know immediately that your protagonist needed to be a female chosen one?
Yeah, well, I wanted her to be a chosen one, but then also the chosen one's girlfriend. So her backstory is more of like the love interest backstory, sort of. Like technically she's one of them, but they all kind of agree that Matt, her boyfriend or current boyfriend slash fiance, I guess that's not too much of a spoiler, but is like the real chosen one. So she ends up being kind of the love interest figure, and that was kind of on purpose. Like the whole backstory is sort of like your basic chosen one story distilled to its most like obvious elements.
It's like all the plot points you need in order to be in the new world where all of it's happening.
Yeah, and it's supposed to be like familiar, right? Like, the Dark Lord, he came, he tried to attack everything and ruin the world, and then they defeated him, and now they moved on. Like, and
everybody's fine. It's all fine.
Yeah, everyone's great except for the PTSD. Everything's great. Yeah. And that's why, I mean, I didn't want to dwell too much on what had come 10 years before, but also I was thinking about the way that a young character would engage with ideas of good and evil, because good and evil will become more complicated the older you get. And so it made sense to me that in the past, Sloane and her friends think of everything as like very black and white, government good, Dark Lord bad, save the world good, the end, you know? But then as she's moving forward through the narrative and the conflict that arises in like the forward motion of the story, she's realizing how everything is actually just weird and in the gray area and more complicated than she realized.
Yes. Oh, I love good gray area. It's so satisfying. So one thing you've talked about, which I think is really interesting, is that writing Sloane, who's the protagonist who we've been talking about, was kind of like wish fulfillment for you because she's a character who doesn't care about whether or not people like her. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so like many people and especially women, I like to be liked, and I also feel the pressure to be likable pretty much at all times. And so writing about a character who is mad about the things that had happened to her and the ways that she was discussed that she did not appreciate, it was cathartic in a way, because like I've had some experiences, not to get too into it, but like I haven't allowed myself to kind of process my feelings about some of the stuff that happened when Divergent came out. And I had like a wild moment in my life, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so writing about her was a way to explore those feelings and to kind of allow myself to engage with them in a deeper way. And it's nice to imagine what it would be like to really not care. But I mean, I would argue that Sloane does care. She's just put on like a really thick armor about it, but yeah.
Jeremy Howard wanted to know how many hours of research would you say you put into preparing for writing Chosen Ones?
Ooh, oh my God. Let me show you my research journal. Hold on. This is the great thing about live stream.
Exciting.
Yeah, so wait, is it upside down? No. It's just like all these all these little notes everywhere.
Wow.
Yeah, this is a conversation with my editor that I printed out for reference. Anyway, I don't know how many hours it was because it happened while writing. I'm not someone who gets buried in research and has trouble getting out of it. I do exactly as much research as I require to write what I'm going to write. And so I like it, but I'm not like into it the way that I think a lot of writers are. They don't know kind of like where the right stopping place is, but I am good with that. In fact, sometimes I need to go back and do more. But I did read like hundreds of declassified government documents for this book.
Did you really?
I did, yeah. Specifically with Project MK Ultra, which was our government's experiments with LSD. I think mostly in the 60s or 70s. Anyway, just because it was like a covert project and it felt like the same structure as these like chosen ones and their project. So I read those, and I also read like Apple product reviews because that became relevant, and I read, newspaper articles and celebrity profiles, and I listened to like whale sounds in the Mariana Trench because there's a whole thing about the deep sea in this book, and I read all this stuff about the space race and the history of modern computing and about architecture and design. And I mean, it was just like, it was so fun, but it was the most research I have ever done for any project.
Well, and that is like delightfully all over the map too.
Yeah, well, it's because I was building an alternate history. It's a little tricky to talk about this without spoiling parts of the book, but
Right.
I developed like an alternate history for Chicago, and that affected, of course, architecture and design and computers and technology. And then the history part, learning about our history and exactly what happened, in 1969 with kind of the onset of the space race and stuff like that. So it's just like man, it was cool.
Yeah, you have a pretty sweet job, Veronica.
I know, I kind of like it.
So yeah, and one thing you kind of hinted at that I think is a really neat part of this book is that, I don't know, how do you describe it? It's like, it's not quite a collage style, but you're like pulling in, like, it's not only the narrative about Sloane and what happens to her, but you'll get like a gossip magazine profile of Sloane and a bunch of declassified like CIA, like intelligence documents and like excerpts from research books and like all kinds of different stuff.
Yeah, so I've been calling them interstitials.
Thank
just
you.
because who knows what to call them. But it was originally, I had only committed to doing them for the first part of the book because they seemed to me to be a good way to communicate what had happened to Sloane and her friends 10 years before without having to do flashbacks, which I really want to avoid, if at all possible. Mm-hmm. And then I just started to like them. And I think they were a great way of kind of including a lot of world building information that maybe wouldn't have been relevant to the narrative, but creates a kind of like richer feeling world, and a more grounded feeling world, even though it's obviously got its fantastical elements. So I decided to continue them through the course of the book. So they are just like sprinkled throughout almost every chapter, but not quite. And they're pretty short.
I think it also is such a fun way to sort of like mix up the reading experience, like it sort of made me feel as a reader as if I were sort of like sleuthing it all out also, because like, some of them, they're relevant, but you don't yet know exactly why they're relevant. And so as a reader, to get to sort of piece that together instead of just being, like having it handed to me on a platter is just like, it's such a satisfying reading experience.
It's a little like a scavenger hunt. Yes.
Yeah. So here's a good question from Janine Edmond. Janine says, I'm a teen who lives in Chicago, and I enjoyed that in the Divergent series, you had the setting be a dystopian Chicago. Obviously, Chosen Ones also takes place in Chicago, as you mentioned. So what's the inspiration? Like, why always Chicago?
Well, I keep trying to come up with like sophisticated answers to this question, but the real truth is that I like it here. I could do my job from literally anywhere, and I decide to do it here. So, it's close to family and it feels like home, but I also I love the way the city looks and feels, and I even love our like horrible winters. So I feel like when you write a book, you have to spend at least a year in your mind in that place. And I just can't think of, I'm like, why would I put it somewhere else? I don't want to spend a year in my mind in another place. So that's really the reason. There are other reasons, like because I was developing an alternate history for this book, there's one of the better visual ways, visual in the text, to reveal that history is through architecture, because so much of our city's skyline is like a reflection of history, because of all the different styles that are represented. So you'd know that you were in an alternate Chicago based on like what buildings were there. Like you could figure out at what point it diverged from your universe by looking at the buildings, which I thought was pretty cool.
Well, and yeah, you could tell pretty quickly too, like the skyline is so iconic that it wouldn't take much looking to to see if something was amiss, you know, like you would know very quickly that you weren't in the same place you thought.
Yeah, or at least I would, because I live here. I don't know about other people.
Sure, that's true. So Chosen Ones is your first adult novel. Why the distinction? How is it different to write? A million questions subsequent about writing an adult novel.
Yeah, so really these category distinctions are only useful until they're not anymore. So it's not, I don't know, it's more about like the thematic differences between young adult work and adult work.
It does seem a little sexier than some of your other writing, I will say.
Well, it is, yeah. But is it? Like, I don't know if it's that much different than the stuff in Carve the Mark. So, you know. Okay. But I mean, there's more like swears, but it's not even because it's an adult book. It's because it's my first book set in a modern world where you'd expect people to have the same language and slang. So that was really more of that. But I think mostly because there's such a wide array of acceptable content and length, pacing, and all kinds of things within YA as an adult. That really the difference comes down to theme. So the book is about what happens after you have achieved your big thing that you've been working toward. And adolescence is defined by working towards something, whether you're working toward college or leaving your parents' house and setting out on your own. It's all about the lead up. And this book is about the after, which is just not, I mean, an adolescent concern exactly. So it's not that it's like not for, it's for any reader that wants to read it, but it's just a little less speaking, it's about who you're speaking to.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. This is a question from a person who entered SecSec1 as their name. They said, so you sold the story based on an outline, but how much of the story did you actually know before you went into it? And how much of it did you discover along the way? You know, a lot of writers have different processes about sort of like start a thing and follow the threads versus, you know, strict outlines. Like, where do you fall kind of on that spectrum?
Well, I had an outline, but I think when people talk about an outline, they think of kind of like a skeletal version of the book, which it certainly is. I mean, it's not like got long narrative chapters or anything, but it was extremely detailed in terms of what the plot would be like. And then I had written about 50 to 75 pages of it that I then threw out and rewrote after the book sold. So a lot of what changed was actually kind of the trappings of it and the way that it looked, the world looked and felt. In my original outline, it was a little more fantasy, like a very different feeling world. And I decided that I was more interested in keeping it closer to our own and making it feel familiar, but like slightly wrong, sort of like when you have a dream and you're like, so-and-so was there, but they didn't look quite right, you know. It's sort of a great unsettling feeling. So I wanted to do that. And then of course, like things change along the way. Like I had, you know, a little bit of a breakdown about 3/4 of the way through the book when I realized I had not thought through the antagonist as well as I thought I did.
Huh.
So my husband and I sat in that room behind me and brainstormed for like 3 days.
So is that a realization that you had on your own, or did someone point it out to you? I'm just kind of curious about like your editorial process with that one.
Yeah, so I after the book sold, my editor, I was like, all right, see ya when it's done in however many months that takes. Bye. And I like didn't talk to him for a long time. So he'd check in and be like, how you doing? Like, fine, get out. So I pretty much keep myself, like, I'll keep myself fully contained until I have a draft. Because that's just how I work best. And then at that point, I shared it.
When you say fully contained, does that mean like your friends aren't reading it, your husband hasn't read it, like it is on lockdown, essentially?
If anyone reads it, it will be my husband, because I just sometimes need to pick his brain about stuff, or even I don't always even need him to talk. I just need to talk to someone about it. It helps if they already know what I'm talking about. Otherwise, it's a very confusing conversation. So. But yeah, other than that, I don't let people read it while I'm doing it.
Mm-hmm. So then you get done with like a draft that you feel good about, and then you hand it off to your editor?
Yes, usually. Occasionally, it has happened in the past that I'll send it to my agent, who I've been working with for over 10 years and trust implicitly. If I'm not feeling sure of the draft, I'll send it to her and just get like some basic notes and an okay, and then I send it to the editor. Yeah.
So the theme of Chicago Humanities Festival in 2020 is vision, which I think is a really interesting theme to look at in Chosen Ones also. Obviously, the concept of vision can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, but the idea of prophecy is such a big one in this book. You know, the idea of like being a visionary, but even just the idea of having your way paved for you as a person who, you know, like very well could be the subject of prophecy. Can you talk a little bit about like how you see that playing into this book?
Yeah, so I decided to make prophecy as technical as possible. So I wish I could find it on the fly, but I can't. Probably I'd spend like 3 minutes flipping through.
Would anyone be mad if we just watched Veronica go through a book for? No, I'm kidding.
But there's a government document where they're like, they're talking about a prophecy, and they say like, we define prophecy as like a vision of a future with like 70% of it has to be like so hard to fulfill that it's like statistically unlikely to happen by accident. And they like go through this like list of criteria for what makes a prophecy, and what makes them take it seriously or something. And I was like, this is totally how the government would interact with prophecy, right? So I did want to make it feel like as not mystical as possible. But so there are multiple prophecies in the book, and I think that's kind of one of the features of Chosen One stories that I like the most. So not every Chosen One story has a prophecy, but those are the ones that I remember the most. And the reason is because I like that moment when someone is told what their future is and they have to decide to either wrestle with it or accept it. And there's a memorable passage in, I think, book 6 of Harry Potter, where they talk about how the prophecy like is not necessarily going to be fulfilled, but it will, because Harry will choose it, and that makes all the difference in the world. And like the interplay between choice and destiny is something that I love about that series, and that I love in general, because there's no, I mean, you have to walk the path, right? And that's a huge part of Dune too. Paul Atreides like trying to figure out to what extent he's going to fulfill this prophecy that has been used to kind of like manipulate the people on this planet. And that part, I mean, is my favorite part of that book too. So I think I wanted to play with it a little bit here.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about it in the context of the His Dark Materials series also, because that's a big. Have you read those?
No, I missed the boat on that one.
They're so good.
I know. I have to go back and read them.
Yeah, I think you'd like them a lot, especially because it's a young girl protagonist in a time when there weren't a lot of those. And yeah, it's a similar, you know, you hear the prophecy and, you know, that question of like, because often you don't even get to choose, right? Like you're just forging ahead and you end up fulfilling it anyway, and you don't even know until it's already over, which is also so fascinating, I think. Like there are just so many different versions of that.
It's like the Law and Order criminal intent versus Law and Order, right? Because you know the prophecy will be fulfilled, but how? That is the central question. So it's like, you know, the crime will be committed, but like the way that it plays out is the interesting part. And I like that because not every plot needs to rely on surprise in order to have tension. Sometimes you can play with dread, which I like.
Yes, yeah. And tell me more about dread instead of surprise, because I love that idea.
Well, I think I first heard this articulated, all credit due, I think, to John Green, because he was talking about this in the context of The Fault in Our Stars, because you kind of know, like, there's an axe hanging over your head while you're reading that book. But so I think that's what he was talking about. But for me, I just felt like when you introduce fate, then people, first of all, wonder whether, like, in this universe, are fates always fulfilled? This is a question I raised in Carve the Mark and also in this book. And I love when, yes, like fates absolutely will be fulfilled, but how? And will trying to avoid them actually bring them about? And what does that do to a story and to a character? Like knowing that they are like bound to do this thing no matter what they do. I don't know, that dread feels like an interesting form of tension, especially for me because I had relied up until that point more on like twists in my books.
Mhm.
And I'll always have twists because I love a good twist, but I think I wanted to expand a little bit in how I was structuring things.
Well, and just the idea that you can, you know, in the first chapter or whatever, like know what happens, but still that there's so much interesting stuff to unpack just in terms of like how you actually get there, as you were saying, is like that still is very satisfying reading experience, you know?
Yeah, and I think it makes it into a puzzle instead of a less of like a yeah, more like you're solving a puzzle the whole time, like you were talking about with the interstitials, like
Mm-hmm.
wanting to put the pieces together and put it together just fast enough that you figure it out before the story does. Is I don't know, it's you want readers to be like kind of pulled in multiple directions while they're reading, and that's one way to do it, I guess.
So, one thing I kind of felt like after reading this book is that to some extent, prophecy is just like an extreme extension of crushingly high expectations.
Yeah.
Does that feel like a reasonable reading to you?
Well, yes, I think so, especially because, I mean, there's a line that was kind of like a thesis statement for me. I have a couple of those in this book, but one of them is Sloane observing that it's strange to know with certainty that you've peaked. Um, and I mean, that's kind of what you're describing is just she has met these extremely high expectations and she saved the world and now it's crushing her. So, um, yeah.
I wonder, this might be an unfair question, and if it is, you can totally ignore it. But like, Divergent was so huge, and you were so young when you wrote those. Do you think part of Sloane's kind of fear of peaking originated from your own? Like, I can't imagine what kind of pressure you would have put on yourself after having written those books and wondering what was next for you.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question because really, Divergent came out at a very special time, not just for YA, but for books in general, when that kind of fervor still felt possible. And it's not that it will never happen again, it's just that it hasn't been happening again with the kind of regularity that it did back when like Twilight and Hunger Games were like and Harry Potter were just such huge cultural presences. And Divergent wasn't in that category, but it was in the kind of like the few that came after that. And then it sort of seemed to slow down in a profound way. And so knowing that you were a part of a special moment is, I don't know, it's interesting because it does help me to navigate that pressure a little bit because I know that it's not just that the book was like that awesome that that was bound to happen. Like that's not how things work.
It was part
And
of being, I mean, it was an amazing series, but it was also like part of a big cultural conversation that you like managed to get in on at a really great time.
yeah, it was a lot of what was going on was interesting timing. So and I know that, and I try to use that to keep the pressure off. But I would have to be a robot not to not to feel like, oh, well, that was it. Like I blew through a series of goals that a lot of authors have and that I never even gotten a moment to articulate to myself. And I feel like all of it happened so quickly. And when I was too young to really appreciate it in the moment because I was so anxious. I mean, I cannot overstate how profoundly anxious I was during that time. And so trying to navigate that aftermath has been really difficult and has required a lot of therapy. So um, it's hard to talk about though because it was such a special and wonderful time that I don't want to talk about it like it was some kind of traumatic or horrible experience because it wasn't.
Yeah.
And it really laid the path for me in a really powerful way to have a solid career after that point. So this is not like a sad tale or anything, but the fact is that even with great and amazing things that happen to you, you will still have to process them.
Mhm.
So that's kind of what, so I don't have like this fear that I've peaked the way that Sloan does, but I definitely
Good.
understand that emotion for sure.
So that gets me wondering, what does success look like for you now?
I love that question. I have had to figure out because, like I said, I never articulated these like really distinct goals for myself, and I'm not sure that I would have articulated like I want to have a book adapted, I want to hit a bestseller list for X amount of time, something like that, because those things are out of your control. And I'm a very pragmatic person, and I don't like shoot for things that I can't control at all. And so what I've realized in the years since those books came out is that I am a very ambitious person, but more about my creative life than about any particular external goals that I can reach. So my focus is always on growth and change as a writer. And um, I feel like now when I know that it's the right story to pursue, not because of some kind of like marketing thing, but because it feels too hard for me to do at that moment. So when I looked at Chosen Ones and I looked at the amount of world building that was ahead of me, I was like, oh God, this is gonna be hard, you know? But that's how I knew that it was the right thing for me at that time. So it's like, it's time for a challenge because that's the only way that you improve. And I have that hunger for that. So,
So Jeremy Howard, this is kind of related, wanted to know, will you sit in a tub full of marshmallows again if Chosen Ones outsells Divergent?
oh, well, first of all, but no, probably not. The marshmallow thing, for those who don't know, was that I had a blog back in the day and I was like, if I get a big book deal one day, I'm going to take a bath in marshmallows. Ah. And then it happened. And I was like, well, I guess I got to keep my promises. So somewhere on YouTube, there's a video of me doing it that I can't take down because I don't have access to that account anymore. But man, it was really fun and also so messy.
That sounds, yeah, yes, that sounds messy.
Yeah, because when you step on marshmallows, you crush them and then they adhere to the surface of your
Yeah,
bathtub.
it sounds real sticky.
It's really sticky. It's horrible. Don't do it.
Here's another audience question. Hunter wanted to know what you're reading right now, which is kind of a fun question.
Yeah, so I'm reading the second book in the Murderbot series by Martha Wells, which is such a great sci-fi series. The first
I
one is
still
all
haven't read those, but this is the second time they've come up in the last couple of weeks, which makes me think it's time.
Yes, I think it is. They're so like I love a misanthropic kind of like sour robot character. There's one in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and then there's Murderbot. So um and Martha Wells does such a good job of kind of occupying like a consciousness that's not a human consciousness, but still keeping it like something that you can understand. So I'm reading the second one, which is called Artificial Condition. But they're like a great series. And I think it's great to read a series of novellas right now because if you're like me and you're like, my head is spinning all the time, then it's more a slightly more bite-sized than a book. So
That's a great recommendation. So you mentioned adaptation. Divergent was made into a series of films. The Divergent series was, and Chosen Ones has also already been optioned, right?
it has been optioned, and it's a bit of a Divergent reunion because Eric Feig, who now runs Picture Start, which is where Chosen Ones sold. He's the one who bought Divergent when he was at Summit Entertainment. So yeah, it's like all the teams back together again. So
That's
we'll see what
awesome.
happens. It's a long process, but very promising start.
Yeah, I was wondering, is there anything you learned from the Divergent process that you're going to kind of bring to this new adaptation?
Um, yeah, I mean, I learned a lot, but mostly what I learned is that you have to choose the people you work with carefully.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and it's hard to know like how to figure that out, but really if you talk to someone about the things that they like about your book and it's the same things that you like, then I think that that's a pretty good start. And that's what I did with Chosen Ones. I know it happened really quickly, so it seems like I didn't take my time with it, but I weirdly did. Had a lot of conversations just to kind of figure out if our visions would match. So.
Well, that's very exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Like amazing. Danit wanted to know, what is your favorite book that is not one of yours?
I mean, that's a good,
it's a fun question.
Clarification to make. But also, I don't know about you, but like, I can't pick a favorite book. It's like picking a favorite speck of dust on a table. Or
okay. Then how about like, what's a book that you keep finding yourself going back to at different stages of your life and still finding different value in every time? How's that?
Oh, well, a good one for that is Sabriel by Garth Nix, which is the start of a series. Those books, I read them when I was a kid, like 11 or 12 years old, and you can read them now as an adult and have no problems whatsoever with the the way that they read and the sophistication of the ideas that are presented there and how engaging they are. It's just great fantasy. I recommend it for sure.
That's awesome. Do you have rules when you're writing about the certain kinds of books that you can and can't read? Like, I know some people are really concerned about, like mimicking other people's writing if they read certain kinds of things while they're trying to write. Is that a thing for you, or can you be pretty like agnostic about it?
No, you have to avoid things that are similar, and it's not necessarily because of mimicry, because I've never been particularly skilled at that. So I pretty much sound the way I sound no matter what I'm reading. But it puts a voice in my head that talks about the finished product. And that's not a voice I can have. So it says like, did you do as good a job as this person? And like, I wonder if, you'll get as good a cover as this book. It's like, you have to stop. So I pretty much read I'll read adult contemporary literary fiction, which is not what I'm writing, or right. I'll read like science, like pop science books like Mary Roach or The Tale of Dueling Neurosurgeons by Sam Keen was a good one that I read. So nonfiction is helpful during drafting.
That makes sense. Have you read The Glass Hotel yet, perchance?
Not yet, no, because I don't know, I've had a really hard time reading during this quarantine for some reason, and but yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And I know you just talked to her, right?
Yeah, Nerdette. It was our Nerdette March book club pick, but the reason why I mention it, Chosen Ones and The Glass Hotel are like very, very, very different books, but I think there are some really interesting thematic connections in terms of like thinking about the thing after it's already happened, and that's actually where a lot of the drama can exist.
Ooh, okay.
And it's been really interesting for me to think about, especially now in this current time, because I don't know about you, but like I'm really curious how we're going to look back on this, and especially thinking about like what creative people are making. Like, are there just being like dozens of shows being pitched right now that are all about people in quarantine,
or will they have some kind of like deeper, not as clear, but like, yeah, sorry, I interrupted you, but
no, I mean, the main thing I can't stop thinking about is just like, is this point of time that we're in actually like the crux of the story, or is this just the weird montage that happens to get to the other action in the story? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the world is gonna look different after this, no matter what. And I hope, I hope that my favorite things are preserved, which is why it's very important to support your local independent bookstore right now, because I would like to see all of them when we come out of this. But anyway, sorry, that I just had to.
Please do not apologize. I like it.
Yeah. But I think this is going to be an interesting time. And I think I've heard from a lot of creative people that it's hard to make things right now. And I think that's because we're still inside what is essentially like a kind of cultural, like traumatic experience. It's like, it's staying at home, so fundamentally it's not that exciting, but a lot of things changed for everyone overnight, and they continue to. So it has been dramatic, And even though it doesn't look so like interesting from the outside that I just haven't put on real pants in 3 weeks, um, it's still a very intense change in the world around me and in my own life. So I do think we'll probably process it like in 6 months and then start to make things that are weird and reflective of this time.
It's just really interesting to me that like almost now more than ever, I want that turnaround to be faster, you know, because like, I don't, has this happened to you where you're like watching a TV show and you're like, what are they all doing at a bar touching each other? Like, this is insane, you know? Like, it's just been really interesting to me how quickly that mentality has shifted, you know?
Yes, it's something that you've trained yourself to be on guard for because you know it's important, and now you're starting to see it everywhere. Um, and I do think it'll take us some time to unlearn that. I'm torn between whether I will see my mom again after this and just like can't stop hugging her, or whether I'll be like so conditioned not to touch her that I'll be like, get out.
Yeah, I've always been a homebody. And so now I'm like, am I ever going to leave? Like, is this just it now? Like, it could be worse. I have a lot of knitting to do, but I don't know. It's just a very interesting time for sure. My last question for you is what's next? We get a second book in the series, right?
We do, or that's the plan anyway. Yeah. Which was not always part of the plan exactly, because I think this book ends in a pretty definitive place. So it's not like a cliffhanger, is my point. But there was still a lot that I wanted to explore. So there will be a second, but that will be it.
You're very clear about that. This is it. This is your boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of have a feeling about how big something can be when I write it. And usually, so yeah, I mean, never say never, I guess, but I usually know.
That makes total sense. Well, Veronica, thank you so much. This was a real.
Yeah, thank you. This was great.
And all of you watching, just a reminder again, if you haven't gotten Chosen Ones yet, it is totally not too late. Support CHF, get it at Seminary Co-op. You can
Seminary Co-op.
You can find a link in the comment section of YouTube. I also just want to quickly say thanks again to the Allstate Insurance Company for generously underwriting this event. Also, thanks to everyone involved for making it happen. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. And don't forget, if you want to support the festival now, of course, it's a really good time to do that. You can visit chicagohumanities.org/donate. Thanks to all of you for tuning in this evening, and take care, everybody. It was really nice to hang with you all.